Marcus Chen carried the heavy stone pitcher through the massive doors of the War Council chamber. The pitcher was filled with fire wine, a drink that only dragons could consume without burning their throats. For humans, even touching the liquid meant certain death, but Marcus had learned to handle the container with special gloves and careful movements. The chamber was enormous, built for creatures much larger than humans. The ceiling stretched high above, carved from black stone that seemed to swallow light. In the center sat a table made from a single piece of obsidian, so large that 50 humans could lie across it. Around this table sat the most powerful dragons in their realm. Marcus had been serving in this chamber for 3 years now. 3 years since the dragons captured him during what was supposed to be a peaceful meeting between humans and dragons. Back then, he had been an engineer on one of Earth's colony ships. Now he was just another human servant, invisible to the mighty dragons who ruled this world. But Marcus still thought like an engineer. Even while pouring wine and cleaning floors, his mind worked constantly. He noticed things. He remembered patterns. He solved problems in his head even when no one asked him to. Today felt different. The dragons were more tense than usual. Their massive forms shifted restlessly in their seats. Their voices, usually calm and controlled, carried an edge of worry. The reason for their concern stood at the head of the table. Warlord Vexatheron was the most feared dragon commander in their empire. He was massive even for a dragon, with scales that shone like polished copper. His wings, when spread, could cast shadows over entire buildings. Scars covered his body, each one telling a story of battles fought and won. But today, something was wrong with Vexatheron. Marcus noticed it immediately as he moved around the table, refilling cups and staying invisible. The great dragon's breathing was slightly labored. Not enough for the other dragons to notice, but Marcus heard it. His engineering training had taught him to listen for small sounds that meant big problems. Vexatheron was speaking about his latest campaign in the Outer Territories. His voice was strong and confident as always, but Marcus heard the tiny pause between some words. The dragon was tired in a way that went beyond normal battle fatigue. The aliens have new weapons, Vexatheron was saying, devices that can pierce our scales. They struck without warning, using tactics we have never seen before. The other dragons leaned forward, their ancient eyes focused on their war leader. These were veteran fighters, each hundreds of years old. They had seen countless battles and survived wars that lasted decades, but the worry in their voices was real. "How many did we lose?" asked General Kyrex, an old red dragon whose scales had faded to deep burgundy with age. 12 of my best warriors, Vexatheron replied. The aliens used some kind of energy weapon. It left strange marks on our armor. Marcus continued his work, but his mind was racing. As he moved closer to Vexatheron to refill the dragon's cup, he got a better look at the commander's armor. The metal plates were indeed marked, but not in the way energy weapons usually damage things. Marcus had seen plenty of weapon damage during his time in space. This looked different. The marks were small and precise, almost like something had eaten tiny holes in the metal. They formed no pattern that suggested directed energy. Instead, they looked almost organic, like the work of some kind of acid or biological process. Marcus kept his face blank as he poured the fire wine. Dragons expected human servants to be empty-headed and obedient. Showing too much intelligence was dangerous, but inside his mind, Marcus was cataloging every detail he could observe. The meeting continued for hours. The dragons discussed strategy and tactics, planning their response to this new alien threat. They spoke of honor and glory, of crushing their enemies with superior firepower. It was all very dragon-like thinking, direct, forceful, and confident, but Marcus heard something else in their discussion. Fear. Not the healthy caution of experienced warriors, but something deeper. They were facing something they didn't understand, and that scared them more than they wanted to admit. As the evening wore on, Marcus noticed more details about Vexatheron. The dragon's great head would occasionally twitch just slightly. His eyes, normally sharp and focused, sometimes seemed to lose their intensity for a few seconds before snapping back to attention. Most telling of all, Vexatheron's scales were changing color in tiny patches. The changes were so small that only someone very close could see them. The bright copper was developing small areas that looked duller, almost gray. Marcus had never seen anything like it in all his time serving the dragons. When the meeting finally ended, The dragons filed out of the chamber one by one. Vextheron was the last to leave, moving more slowly than his usual confident stride. As he passed Marcus, the dragon paused for a moment. "Human," Vextheron said, his voice carrying that commanding tone all dragons used with servants. "Tomorrow we plan the great campaign against these aliens. Make sure the chamber is prepared for a long session." "Yes, Lord Commander," Marcus replied, keeping his eyes down as he had been taught. Vextheron studied him for a moment longer than necessary. For just an instant, Marcus thought he saw something strange in the dragon's eyes. Not the usual arrogant confidence, but something else. Something almost desperate. Then the moment passed, and Vextheron swept from the room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. Marcus began cleaning the chamber, but his mind was elsewhere. Everything he had observed today pointed to the same conclusion, one that terrified him. The great warlord Vextheron was sick, not injured from battle, not tired from campaigning, but genuinely ill with something Marcus had never seen before. The armor damage, the breathing problems, the color changes in his scales, the occasional loss of focus, they all pointed to some kind of biological problem. But what kind of illness could affect a dragon? And more importantly, what if it was contagious? Marcus finished his cleaning and retired to his small quarters in the servants' section of the fortress. The room was barely large enough for a bed and a small table, but it was private. Here, hidden from dragon eyes, Marcus allowed himself to think freely. He pulled out a small device he had managed to build from salvaged parts over the past year. It looked like a simple cleaning tool, but it was actually a basic scanner capable of detecting electromagnetic patterns and biological signatures. Tomorrow, he would need to use it to get more information about Vextheron's condition. The problem was that if Marcus was right about the dragon being sick, then tomorrow's war planning session could be a disaster. If Vextheron was carrying some kind of alien disease, he could infect the entire war council. And if the disease affected their thinking, the dragons might make decisions that would doom their entire civilization. Marcus lay on his narrow bed, staring at the stone ceiling. 3 years ago, he had been a respected engineer working on humanity's expansion into space. Now he was a servant whose opinion mattered to no one. But he might be the only person in the fortress who could see what was really happening to their great war leader. The question was, what could he possibly do about it? Outside his window, the great fortress of Pyrethane settled into its nightly quiet. But Marcus Chen, former engineer and current servant, lay awake planning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and he needed to be ready. The fate of dragons and humans alike might depend on what an invisible servant could discover. The next morning came too quickly for Marcus. He had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities and fears about what he had observed the day before. Now he stood outside the War Council chamber, preparing for what could be the most important day of his life. The chamber was already buzzing with activity when Marcus entered. The dragons had arrived early, their massive forms filling the space with an energy that felt different from yesterday. Where before there had been worry, now there was anticipation. The veteran dragons were ready for war. Marcus began his usual routine of preparing the chamber, but today he moved with extra care. Hidden in his cleaning supplies was the scanner he had built. Every few minutes, when no dragon was looking his way, he would take readings and store the data for later analysis. Warlord Vextheron entered the chamber with his usual commanding presence, but Marcus noticed that the dragon's condition had worsened overnight. The slight breathing difficulty was now more pronounced, though still subtle enough that the other dragons didn't seem to notice. The gray patches on his scales had spread slightly, and there was a new tension in the way he moved. "Brothers," Vextheron addressed the council, his voice still strong despite his obvious illness. "Today we plan the destruction of these alien invaders. They have dared to challenge the might of our empire, and they will pay the price." The other dragons roared their approval, their voices shaking the stone walls. General Kyrek spread a massive star map across the obsidian table, showing the outer territories where the alien encounters had taken place. "Tell us more about their weapons." "Vextheron," said Commander Silax, a sleek black dragon with silver markings. "How do we counter what we've never faced before?" Marcus moved closer, pretending to organize some scrolls while actually listening carefully to every word. As Vextheron described the alien attacks, Marcus compared the dragon's account with what his scanner readings were telling him. "They strike from hiding," Vextheron explained. pointing to various locations on the map. "Their weapons leave no energy signature that our sensors can detect. The wounds they inflict are small but precise, somehow bypassing our natural armor." Marcus frowned as he processed this information. Energy weapons always left distinctive signatures, and any technology advanced enough to completely hide those signatures should have left other traces. But according to his scanner, there were no technological residues on Vexatheron's armor at all. What his scanner did detect was far more disturbing. There were organic compounds present that didn't match dragon biology, microscopic traces of something that seemed to be both alive and artificial at the same time. The readings suggested some kind of biological agent that was actively changing the structure of Vexatheron's scales and armor. "We should strike immediately," declared General Thane, an older dragon, whose blue scales were marked with countless battle scars. "Mass our forces and burn their worlds to ash. It's the dragon way." The other dragons voiced their agreement, but Marcus noticed that Vexatheron's response was slightly delayed. For just a moment, the war leader seemed confused, as if he had forgotten what they were discussing. Then his focus returned, sharper and more intense than before. "Yes," Vexatheron said, his voice carrying a new edge of aggression. "We mobilize everything. Every dragon, every ship, every weapon. We will show these aliens the true meaning of fear." Something in the dragon's tone made Marcus look up from his work. There was a hunger in Vexatheron's eyes that seemed wrong somehow. Dragons were natural predators, but this was different. This was the look of something that needed to spread, to infect, to consume. Marcus forced himself to continue his duties while his mind raced. The pattern was becoming clearer, and it terrified him. This wasn't about alien weapons at all. Vexatheron had been infected with something during his encounters with the aliens, something that was changing him from the inside while making him more aggressive and less rational. The War Council spent the morning planning their campaign. They discussed troop movements, supply lines, and target priorities. But Marcus noticed that every suggestion from Vexatheron involved close combat, direct engagement, and maximum contact between dragon forces and their enemies. Exactly what a spreading infection would want. During a brief break in the discussions, Marcus managed to get close enough to Vexatheron to take more detailed scans. The results made his blood run cold. The organic agents in the dragon system weren't just changing his scales and behavior. They were actively interfering with his brain chemistry, specifically the areas that controlled rational thought and caution. Worse, Marcus detected traces of the same organic compounds on some of the other dragons who had been near Vexatheron. The infection was already beginning to spread through casual contact. "Human," General Kyrex called out, startling Marcus from his analysis. "Bring more firewine. This planning is thirsty work." Marcus bowed and went to fetch fresh supplies, using the opportunity to think about what he had discovered. The situation was far worse than anyone realized. The dragons were planning a massive military campaign that would put thousands of their warriors in direct contact with whatever had infected their leader. Instead of fighting aliens, they would be spreading an infection that could destroy their entire civilization. But who would believe a human servant? The dragons saw humans as barely intelligent creatures, useful only for simple labor. They would never accept that Marcus could understand something that their centuries of experience had missed. When Marcus returned with the wine, he found the dragons deep in heated discussion about battle tactics. Vexatheron was arguing for extremely aggressive strategies that would maximize physical contact with enemy forces. Some of the older dragons were beginning to express doubts, but Vexatheron's legendary reputation as a war leader was swaying their opinions. "The aliens expect us to be cautious," Vexatheron was saying, his eyes now showing a fevered intensity. "They think they can hide from us, strike from a distance, and wear us down slowly. But we are dragons. We will overwhelm them with such force that they won't have time to use their cowards' weapons." Marcus noticed that several dragons, who had been sitting near Vexatheron, were now nodding more enthusiastically than they had earlier. The infection was definitely spreading, and it was affecting their judgment just as it had their leaders. "Perhaps we should study their technology first," suggested Commander Silax, one of the dragons who had been sitting farther from Vexatheron. "Know our enemy before we strike. Coward," Vexatheron roared, rising to his full height. For a moment, Marcus thought the war leader might actually attack his fellow dragon. "You sound like these pathetic humans, always thinking instead of acting." The chamber fell silent. Dragons rarely showed such disrespect to their peers, especially in formal council. But the other dragons seemed to attribute Vexatheron's outburst to battle stress, rather than recognizing it as a symptom of something more serious. Marcus realized he was running out of time. Once the dragons committed to their invasion plan, there would be no stopping them. Thousands of dragon warriors would be exposed to whatever was controlling their leader, and the infection would spread beyond any hope of containment. He needed proof that the other dragons couldn't ignore, something that would force them to see what their pride and assumptions were blinding them to. But how could a human servant convince a council of ancient dragon warriors that they were all in mortal danger? As the meeting continued into the afternoon, Marcus began forming a desperate plan. It was dangerous and would certainly expose him to terrible punishment if it failed. But if he did nothing, the consequences for both dragons and humans would be far worse. The great dragons continued their planning, unaware that their fate might depend on the courage and cleverness of the human servant. They barely noticed. Marcus Chen, engineer turned servant, prepared to risk everything on a gamble that would either save two civilizations or destroy his own life in the attempt. The chamber echoed with dragon voices planning for war, but Marcus heard only the ticking of an invisible clock counting down to disaster. Marcus spent the evening in his quarters, analyzing all the data his scanner had collected. The small device wasn't as sophisticated as the equipment he had used as an engineer, but it was enough to paint a terrifying picture of what was happening. To Warlord Vexatheron, the organic agent infecting the dragon, Commander was unlike anything in the databases Marcus had memorized during his years working with alien biology. It was sophisticated beyond anything he had encountered, able to alter brain chemistry while remaining almost undetectable to standard dragon medical knowledge. The parasites were microscopic but incredibly complex. They attached themselves to neural tissue and began slowly rewriting the host's behavior patterns. The process made the host more aggressive, less cautious, and most importantly, driven to seek physical contact with others. It was the perfect biological weapon, one that turned its victims into unwitting spreaders of the infection. Marcus studied the progression patterns in his data. Vexatheron had been infected for at least 2 weeks based on the cellular changes visible in his scales. The infection had started small but was now spreading throughout the dragon's system. Within days it would reach critical mass, at which point Vexatheron would become little more than a puppet for the parasitic intelligence. The truly horrifying part was how clever the infection was. It didn't make its hosts obviously sick or weak. Instead, it made them seem more passionate, more decisive, more ready for battle. To other dragons, Vexatheron probably seemed like he was at the peak of his warrior spirit. But Marcus could see the truth in his data. The parasites were preparing for a massive reproduction cycle, one that would require thousands of new hosts. The planned invasion wasn't just military strategy gone wrong. It was a biological trap designed to infect the entire dragon military. A soft knock at his door interrupted Marcus's analysis. He quickly hid his scanner and data before opening the door to find Kira, another human servant who worked in the kitchens. "Marcus," she whispered, glancing nervously down the corridor. "Something strange is happening. Some of the dragons are acting different, more angry, more demanding. The kitchen staff is scared." Marcus felt his heart sink. If the infection was already affecting dragons outside the War Council, it was spreading faster than he had calculated. "Which dragons?" he asked quietly. "General Kyrex and Commander Thane, mostly. They've been spending a lot of time with Warlord Vexatheron, and now they're snapping at servants for no reason. Yesterday, General Kyrex actually threatened to eat one of the cleaning staff because she accidentally made noise while he was thinking." Marcus nodded grimly. The infection was following exactly the pattern his data suggested. Close contact with Vexatheron was exposing other dragons to the parasites, and their behavior was beginning to change as the organisms established themselves in new hosts. "Kira," Marcus said carefully, "I need you to do something important, but you have to trust me. Can you make sure that none of the human staff get too close to any of the dragons who have been acting strange? Find excuses to keep distance, and don't let anyone else know why." Kira studied his face with sharp eyes. She was one of the smarter humans in the fortress, captured like Marcus during various conflicts with the dragons. "This is about more than just angry dragons, isn't it?" Marcus hesitated, then decided to trust her with part of the truth. "I think some of the dragons might be sick with something contagious. I'm not sure yet, but until I know more, we need to be careful." Kira nodded and slipped away into the shadows. Marcus closed his door and returned to his analysis, but now with a growing sense of urgency. The infection was spreading faster than expected, and tomorrow's War Council session would likely be the point of no return. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching Marcus's mood as he prepared for what might be the most important day in both human and dragon history. He had spent the night devising a plan that was equal parts brilliant and insane. If it worked, he might save thousands of lives. If it failed, he would certainly die and probably take the hope of stopping the infection with him. Marcus arrived at the War Council chamber early and began preparing his trap. The room's environmental systems were complex but followed standard engineering principles that Marcus understood well. Using knowledge gained from 3 years of maintenance work, he began making subtle adjustments to the electromagnetic field generators that controlled temperature and air circulation. The changes he made were invisible to casual observation but would create specific frequency patterns that his research suggested might disrupt the parasite's neural control. If his theory was correct, the modifications would force the infected dragons to show visible symptoms that even their fellow council members couldn't ignore. The dragons began arriving for the session, and Marcus immediately noticed that more of them were showing early signs of infection. At least 6 of the 12 council members now carried traces of the parasitic organisms, though most were still in the early stages where symptoms were barely noticeable. Warlord Vexatheron entered last, and Marcus was shocked by how much the dragon had deteriorated overnight. The gray patches on his scales had spread significantly, and there was a fevered intensity in his eyes that made Marcus step back instinctively. The infection was approaching its final stages. "Brothers," Vexatheron addressed the council, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled violence. "Today we finalize our plans for the Great Cleansing. The aliens will learn what happens to those who dare challenge dragon superiority." The infected dragons roared their approval with unusual enthusiasm, while the uninfected members of the council exchanged worried glances. Some of the older dragons were clearly beginning to sense that something was wrong, but they couldn't identify what. Marcus activated his environmental modifications gradually, increasing the electromagnetic frequencies slowly enough that the changes seemed like normal fluctuations. At first, nothing visible happened. The dragons continued their discussion of invasion routes and attack strategies. But as the frequencies reached the levels Marcus had calculated, Vexatheron began to show signs of distress. His great head twitched more frequently and his speech became slightly slurred. More importantly, the gray patches on his scales began to pulse with a sickly phosphorescent glow. "Vexatheron," General Kyrex said with concern, "are you feeling well? Your scales are—" "I'm fine." Vexatheron snarled, but even as he spoke, the glow in his scales intensified. Other infected dragons were beginning to show similar symptoms as the electromagnetic fields disrupted their parasitic passengers. Commander Silax, one of the uninfected dragons, stood up slowly. "By the ancient fires," he breathed, "I know what this is. I've seen it in the old records. Parasitic mind burn. But that's supposed to be extinct." The recognition in Silax's voice sent a shock through the chamber. The ancient dragons had encountered similar infections in their distant past, but those incidents had been lost to legend and half-remembered warnings. Now the knowledge was coming back to them as they watched their war leader writhe in obvious distress. "Impossible," said one of the infected dragons, but his protest was weakened by the fact that his own scales were beginning to glow. "Vexatheron is the strongest warrior in our realm. Nothing could infect him." Marcus increased the electromagnetic intensity one more level, and the effect was dramatic. Vexatheron let out a roar of pain and fury that shook the entire chamber. The parasites, now clearly visible as writhing threads of light beneath his scales, were fighting to maintain control of their host. "The human," Vexatheron suddenly screamed, his eyes fixing on Marcus with murderous intensity. "He's doing this! Kill him!" But the other dragons were too shocked to respond to the command. They were watching their legendary war leader reveal himself as the victim of an alien infection, and their entire worldview was crumbling around them. "If Vexatheron is infected," Commander Silax said grimly, "then everyone who has been in close contact with him may be infected too. And the invasion force would spread the infection to every dragon world in the Empire," finished General Thane, his face pale with horror. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and terror as he watched the dragons finally understand the truth. His plan had worked. The infection was now visible and undeniable. But Vexus Theron was staring at him with the focused hatred of a cornered predator, and Marcus knew that his life expectancy could now be measured in minutes. The chamber erupted into chaos as infected and uninfected dragons began to realize they were facing a threat that could destroy their entire civilization. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Chen, no longer an invisible servant but the human who had saved the Dragon Empire from destroying itself. The War Council chamber descended into chaos as the truth of the infection became impossible to deny. Vex Theron writhed in his seat, the parasitic organisms under his scales glowing brighter as Marcus's electromagnetic field disrupted their control. Several other dragons were showing similar symptoms, their scales beginning to pulse with the same sickly light. "This is impossible," General Kyrex gasped, staring at the luminous threads visible beneath his own armor. "How could we not have seen this?" "Because it didn't want to be seen," Commander Silax replied grimly. He was one of the few dragons still uninfected, and his ancient knowledge was proving invaluable. Parasitic mind burn is mentioned in our oldest histories. It makes the host more aggressive while hiding its presence, the perfect biological weapon. Marcus continued adjusting the electromagnetic frequencies, trying to maintain the field that was revealing the infection while staying as invisible as possible. But Vex Theron's blazing eyes remained fixed on him, and the war leader's voice carried a terrifying mix of rage and alien intelligence. "The human knows," Vexus Theron snarled, rising to his full height, despite the obvious pain the electromagnetic field was causing him. "He has been watching, learning, interfering. We must eliminate him before he can damage our plans further." "Our plans?" Commander Thane repeated, his own scales beginning to show traces of phosphorescent glow. "These aren't our plans anymore, are they? These are the plans of whatever is inside us." The realization sent a shock through even the infected dragons. The parasites had been so subtle in their manipulation that their hosts hadn't realized how much their thinking had been altered. The aggressive invasion strategy, the emphasis on close combat, the dismissal of caution, all of it had been designed to spread the infection as widely as possible. But now the parasites' control was weakening under Marcus's electromagnetic assault, and their hosts were beginning to remember what their own thoughts felt like. The cognitive dissonance was driving some of the infected dragons to the edge of madness. "I can feel them," General Kyrex moaned, clawing at his own scales. "They're in my head, changing my thoughts. How long have they been controlling me?" "Long enough to plan the destruction of our entire species," Silax answered. "If we had launched that invasion, we would have infected our entire military. And from there, every dragon world in the Empire," Thane finished, his voice hollow with horror. Marcus realized this was his chance to provide more information, but he needed to be careful. Speaking directly to the dragons could still get him killed, especially by the infected ones who were fighting the parasite's influence. "The infection spreads through close contact," Marcus called out, his voice barely audible over the chaos in the chamber. "Physical touch, shared air in enclosed spaces, blood contact. It's been spreading through the War Council for days." Vexus Theron let out a roar of fury and lunged toward Marcus, but his movement was clumsy and uncontrolled. The electromagnetic field was disrupting the parasite's coordination, making the infected dragons dangerous but less precise in their actions. Commander Silax moved to intercept, his massive form blocking Vexus Theron's path. "Stand down, old friend. You're not yourself anymore. I am more myself than I have ever been." Vex Theron screamed, but even as he spoke, the light under his scales pulsed in patterns that clearly weren't natural. The weak thoughts, the cautious strategies, the hesitation, all gone. "This is what a true dragon should be." "This is what a puppet looks like," Silax replied sadly. "And I won't let you destroy our people to feed whatever is controlling you." The battle that erupted was unlike anything Marcus had ever witnessed. Dragon combat was normally a thing of terrible beauty, with opponents maneuvering for advantage while exchanging bursts of flame and precise strikes with claws and teeth. But this fight was chaotic and desperate. Infected dragons attacking with mindless fury while the uninfected tried to subdue them without causing permanent harm. Marcus realized that his electromagnetic field was making the situation worse in some ways. While it revealed the infection and disrupted the parasite's control, it was also driving the infected dragons into a frenzy. He needed to find a way to help the uninfected dragons without causing the infected ones to become completely uncontrollable. Moving carefully around the edge of the chamber, Marcus made his way to the main control panel for the room's systems. His 3 years of maintenance work had taught him every circuit and connection, and he began implementing a desperate plan. If he couldn't destroy the parasites directly, maybe he could create an environment where they couldn't survive. The organisms seemed to require specific electromagnetic conditions to maintain their neural control. By cycling the field strength and frequency, he might be able to disrupt them enough for the dragon's natural immune systems to fight back. The risk was enormous. If he guessed wrong about the parasite's requirements, he could make them stronger instead of weaker. And if the infected dragons realized what he was doing, they would certainly kill him before he could complete the process. Marcus began his work, cycling the electromagnetic fields in patterns based on his analysis of the parasite's behavior. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The infected dragon's symptoms became more erratic, with the glowing under their scales flickering on and off like failing lights. "What's happening to them?" Thane called out as he wrestled with an infected dragon who had moments before been his friend and ally. "The human is disrupting their control mechanisms," Silax replied, breathing heavily from his battle with Vexatheron, "but I don't know if he can maintain it long enough for our immune systems to fight back." Marcus gritted his teeth and continued his work, fine-tuning the electromagnetic patterns while chaos raged around him. Dragon voices roared in pain, fury, and confusion as the ancient predators fought a battle for their very minds. Suddenly, General Kyrex collapsed, his massive form hitting the stone floor with a crash that shook the entire chamber. For a terrifying moment, Marcus thought he had killed the dragon. Then Kyrex's eyes opened, and when he spoke, his voice was weak but clear. "The burning in my head is gone," Kyrex gasped. "I can think clearly again." "How long was I not myself?" 3 days, Silax answered, hope creeping into his voice. "Can you feel the parasites?" Kyrex closed his eyes and seemed to probe his own body with internal senses that humans didn't possess. "They're still there, but they're dying. My immune system is finally recognizing them as invaders." Marcus felt a surge of triumph, but it was short-lived. Vexatheron had broken free from his struggle with Silax and was charging directly toward the control panel where Marcus stood. The war leader's eyes burned with hatred and alien intelligence, and Marcus knew he had only seconds before those massive claws would end his life. But as Vexatheron reached him, the dragon suddenly stumbled and fell. The electromagnetic patterns Marcus had created were finally having their full effect, and the parasite's control was collapsing completely. Vexatheron lay on the floor, breathing heavily, his scales slowly returning to their normal copper color as the alien glow faded away. "Human," Vexatheron whispered, his voice weak but recognizably his own again. "What have you done to me?" "Saved your life," Marcus replied simply, "and possibly your entire species." Around the chamber, the other infected dragons were slowly recovering as their immune systems, no longer suppressed by the parasite's interference, began destroying the alien organisms. The Great War Council was finally free of the infection that had nearly led them to destroy themselves, but Marcus knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, the aliens who had created this biological weapon were still waiting, and now both humans and dragons would need to work together if they hoped to survive what was coming next. The War Council chamber was quiet for the first time in hours. The great dragons lay exhausted on the stone floor, their massive forms slowly recovering from the battle for their minds. Marcus stood by the control panel, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline of the past few hours. He had saved the Dragon Empire, but he wasn't sure what that meant for his own future. Warlord Vexatheron was the first to fully recover. The great dragon slowly pulled himself upright, his copper scales once again gleaming with their natural luster. But when he looked at Marcus, there was something in his eyes that had never been there before. Respect. "Human," Vexatheron said, his voice still weak but carrying genuine gratitude. "I owe you a debt that cannot be repaid. You saw what we could not. You saved us from a fate worse than death." Commander Silax nodded in agreement. The ancient texts speak of parasitic mind burn, but they describe it as a legend, a cautionary tale. We never imagined it could be real, or that it could be so perfectly designed to exploit our warrior nature. General Kyrex, still recovering from his ordeal, managed to speak. "How did you know, human? How did you see what dragons with centuries of experience missed?" Marcus took a deep breath before answering. For 3 years he had hidden his intelligence and training, pretending to be a simple servant. Now, for the first time, he could speak to the dragons as an equal. "I'm not just a servant," Marcus began carefully. "Before you captured me, I was an engineer. I worked with alien biology, studied how different species adapted and evolved. When I saw the damage to Vextheron's armor and the changes in his behavior, I recognized the patterns." "Patterns," Silax repeated thoughtfully. "We were looking for military threats, thinking like warriors. You were looking for scientific problems, thinking like a scholar." "Different perspectives," Marcus confirmed. "Dragons have incredible experience with combat and strategy. But you think in terms of honor, direct confrontation, and proving strength. The parasites were designed specifically to exploit that mindset. They made you want to fight, to make contact with enemies, to spread the infection through the very behaviors that make dragons successful warriors." The implications of this hung heavy in the air. The dragons were beginning to understand that their greatest strengths had been turned against them, and that only an outsider's perspective had been able to see the trap. "There's something else," Marcus continued, knowing this next revelation would be even more difficult for them to accept. "The aliens who created this infection know a lot about dragon psychology and biology. This wasn't a random weapon. It was specifically designed to target your species. Someone has been studying you for a long time." Vextheron's eyes hardened, but not with the fevered aggression of the infection. This was the cold anger of a military commander who understood he had been outmaneuvered. "You're saying this was a deliberate strategy to destroy us from within?" "Yes. And if I'm right about their methods, they're probably watching to see if their weapon worked. When your invasion force doesn't arrive on schedule, they'll know something went wrong. They might try again, possibly with something even more dangerous." The dragons exchanged worried glances. They had barely survived this attack, and only because of the intervention of a human servant they had considered barely intelligent. The thought of facing an enemy capable of such sophisticated biological warfare was sobering. Commander Thane, who had remained quiet during his recovery, finally spoke. "What do you suggest we do, human? Your knowledge saved us once. Perhaps it can guide us again." Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and fear. The dragons were finally asking for his opinion, but the responsibility was enormous. His next words could shape the future of both species. "First, we need to completely quarantine anyone who might have been exposed to the infection. The parasites are dying in the dragons who were treated, but we need to make sure there are no secondary infections. Second, we need to study the alien technology more carefully but safely. And third," Marcus paused, knowing this next suggestion would be the most difficult for the dragons to accept. "Third," Vextheron prompted, "you need to reconsider your relationship with humanity. This infection was designed to exploit dragon psychology specifically. Humans think differently, see patterns you might miss. If you're going to face enemies this sophisticated, you're going to need allies who can provide different perspectives." The chamber fell silent as the dragons processed this suggestion. For millennia, they had considered humans to be inferior beings, useful only for simple labor. The idea of treating humans as equals, as partners in defending their empire, challenged everything they believed about themselves. "You're asking us to change the fundamental structure of our society," Silax said slowly. "I'm asking you to survive," Marcus replied bluntly. "The aliens who did this aren't going to stop with one attack. They've shown they can create biological weapons specifically designed to exploit your weaknesses. If you want to defend against future attacks, you need people who think differently than you do." General Kyrex struggled to his feet, his massive form still unsteady but his voice growing stronger. "The human speaks wisdom. We have prided ourselves on our strength and experience, but pride nearly destroyed us. Perhaps it is time to value intelligence over tradition." "What exactly are you proposing?" Vextheron asked Marcus directly. Marcus chose his words carefully. He was about to make a proposal that would have seemed impossible just hours ago. A formal alliance between dragons and humans, not as masters and servants, but as partners. Dragons provide strength, military expertise, and resources. Humans provide scientific knowledge, different thinking patterns, and the ability to see threats from unexpected angles. "And in return," Thane asked, "peace between our species. No more capturing human ships or enslaving our people. Joint colonies where both species can thrive, shared technology and knowledge. A united front against threats like the one we just faced." The dragons were quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. Marcus could see the internal struggle in their faces as they weighed centuries of tradition against the undeniable fact that a human had just saved their civilization. Finally, Vex Theron spoke. "You have earned the right to make such a proposal, Marcus Chen, and we have learned that our survival may depend on accepting it. But this decision is too large for a war council to make alone. It must go before the Dragon High Command." "I understand," Marcus replied. "But while you're considering the long-term alliance, there are immediate steps we should take. The infected dragons need continued monitoring to make sure the parasites are completely eliminated. We need to develop better detection methods for future biological attacks, and we need to warn other dragon territories about this threat." "Agreed," Silak said. "And we need to prepare for the aliens' next move. They will eventually realize their weapon failed, and they will adapt their strategy accordingly." Over the next several hours, the War Council transformed from a group planning conquest into a crisis management team focused on survival. Marcus found himself at the center of these discussions, his insights valued and respected in a way that would have been impossible before the infection crisis. As the emergency session finally concluded, Vex Theron approached Marcus privately. The Great Dragon's demeanor was completely different from the arrogant war leader who had entered the chamber that morning. "Human, Marcus," Vex Theron corrected himself. "I have fought battles across 100 worlds, commanded armies that could burn entire planets. But today I learned that the greatest victories sometimes come from the wisdom to see what others cannot. You have my respect and my gratitude." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of history in that moment. "Thank you, Vex Theron. I hope this is the beginning of something better for both our peoples." "It will be," the Dragon War leader replied. "I will personally recommend to the High Command that your alliance proposal be accepted. The age of dragon supremacy is ending, but perhaps the age of dragon-human partnership can begin." As Marcus finally left the War Council chamber, he reflected on how much had changed in a single day. He had entered as a servant and was leaving as a respected advisor, and potentially the architect of a new era of cooperation between species. The future was still uncertain, and there were undoubtedly many challenges ahead. The aliens who had created the parasitic weapon were still out there, and other threats might emerge. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt hope. The dragons had learned that strength alone wasn't enough to guarantee survival. They would need wisdom, adaptability, and the willingness to see the universe through different eyes. And perhaps with humans and dragons working together, both species could face whatever challenges the galaxy had in store for them. Outside the fortress walls, the stars shone down on a world where the impossible had become possible, where a human servant had become a hero, and where two species had taken their first steps toward a shared future among the stars.